Welcome to We Learn Virtual Learning Network. This is session number 9, What it means to be a parliamentary democracy. Topics which we are going to cover in this session are evolution, features of parliamentary system of government, parliamentary system in India. So coming towards the very first topic of the session, that is evolution. The origins of the British Parliament can be traced to 13th century when the King John of Great Britain called together a few discreet knights and other nobles to advise him on the necessity and methods for tax collection. These meetings were also used to advise the king on particular issue of public importance. These meetings are called parliament. During the Stuart rule, there ensued a tussle between the kings and the parliament over religious and foreign policies that lead to a civil war resulting in the execution of King Charles 1649 for treason and the disposing of King James II in the bloodless revolution. During the reign of King George I in the early 18th century, the institution of cabinet began to take shape. Within the cabinet, the king had begun to rely on one individual, called the Prime Minister, to preside over the cabinet meetings and conveyed its decisions to him. With the rise of liberal and conservative parties following the realignment of political forces after the 1832 reforms, on the one hand, and the extension of franchise on the other, position of the Prime Minister got strengthened. The British parliamentary system, also known as the Westminster government, has some unique features. First, there is no single document referred to as the Constitution. The institution and practice have developed through conventions. Secondly, in the absence of written constitution, there are no special amending procedures. The British Parliament enjoys great flexibility. Often described as parliamentary supremacy, the British Parliament has an unlimited authority recognized by the judiciary to make any law or to amend any law already made. No other body or court has the right to overrule or set aside the legislation. Coming towards the feature of parliamentary system of government. The executive, the cabinet ministers sit as members of parliament and play a double role in fusion of executive and legislative powers. Those who recommend legislation as a member of cabinet also vote on the same legislation as members of the governing legislature. Typically, the government is the cabinet and the rest of the members of the majority part or coalition of parties in the parliament. The government, in the sense, has an automatic majority and most decisions are made among those groups. The executive is selected on the basis of majority support in the parliament and not directly elected. The government is accountable only to the parliament. Second, the executive branch of government is divided into legally formal head of states and the head of the government, who exercise most of the executive powers and is responsible to the parliament. The function of the head of the state is not to govern but to see that there is a government. Parliament democracy means collegial executive. The collegial executive is a collection of ministers, that is cabinet, who must make decision as a group and must be in the general agreement before legislation is recommended or policies are proposed. The ministers are both individual and collectively responsible to the parliament of their actions. Parliament democracy also means a democracy based on the party responsibility. Disapproving big state structure, Mahatma Gandhi favored the establishment of decentralized structures whose social and political rules are informed by the ethics. The parliament, according to Gandhi, remains under the control of ministers who constantly change. The executive, the council of ministers headed by the prime ministers, come from the legislature and is collectively responsible to it. Next is the parliamentary systems. The process of making this elaborate parliamentary structure function depends upon the political parties, which constitute the crucial element in any parliamentary form of the government. A non-parliamentary government is not dictated by its dependence on a preliminary majority for counting in office. By acquiring a fixed tenure, a non-parliamentary system tends to value stability rather than responsibility. The restraint upon government activities and policies is maintained through the introduction of no confidence motion, cut motions, adjournment motions, and calling attentions. The parliamentary structure has also been replicated at the level of states that respect their autonomy and the federal spirit that legitimate the unity of the union. The Constitution empower the Parliament to impeach the President for the violation of the Constitution. The President is also an integral part of the Parliament and is vested with powers by the Constitution that helps to check parliamentary impropriety in case of inability of political parties to secure parliamentary majority or its loss at any given time. In short, in our parliamentary democracy, the legitimacy to rule is vested in the parliament, which it derives from the willing consent of the people who make up the electorate. It is the collective personality of the parliament that imposes a code upon the conduct of both individual and political parties. The parliament is the protector of individual liberty and the foundation of India's law. In the Indian parliamentary system, as in the other parliamentary system, the government governs in and through the parliament, thereby fusing the legislative and executive branches. The Indian Constitution in Article 75 emphasizes his peculiar fusion by maintaining that if a minister is not a member of any house within a period of 6 months, he shall cease to be a minister. In other words, only a member of the parliament, which is the legislative body, can become a minister of the government or a member of executive. The council of minister is therefore said to be hyphen that links the legislative branch of the state to the executive branch. In the parliamentary system, which is sometimes referred to as the prime ministerial form or cabinet form of government, the cabinet comprised of few leading ministers headed by the prime minister makes all important policy decisions. The member of the cabinet are allowed to play important political roles in rendering policy directives but under all over supervision and authority of the Prime Minister. However, since the time of Lal Bahadur Shastri, the Prime Minister's office or the PMO has emerged an important alternative source to the power of the cabinet. The authority of the PMO was subsequently reinforced under Mrs. Indira Gandhi and its role enlarged in actual decision making. This authority of the cabinet or the PMO has to some extent encroached upon parliamentary prerogatives and its legislative process, most notably through the frequent passage of legislation by ordinance issues in the name of the parliament. Governance is not merely dictated by institutional structure that is established but is dialectic of the interaction of the institution and the political structure, with each having an impact on other. Parliamentary processes were clouded by the charisma of Jawaharlal Nehru, who, according to Ashish Nandi, had himself become the opposition, criticizing his ministers for lapses or extolling them to implement policies for development. Parliament legitimacy and sanctionity suffered tremendous challenges during the regime of Mrs. Gandhi. The fundamental principle of parliamentary democracy, like freedom of expression, enjoyment of civil liberties, a free press, and opposition, were gagged through the imposition of emergency under Article 352. The India parliamentary system saw its breakdown for a belief integrum in 1975, restored in 1977, survival of the fall of Janata government in 1979, and the return to power of Mrs. Gandhi. The consequent Barbary trial has thrown up challenges for our parliamentary processes, with question as to whether acts within the parliament are subject to judicial interpretation or not. The Indian parliamentary structure thus matured through these trials and tribunal from being an institution dominated by the single party to the emergence of a fractured polity with highly polarized political opinions and mandate. Demands for restructuring the political structure have gained momentum due to these unstable moments. It has been met with immense opposition. That's all for this session, and there are some questions which are based on this session. Explain One of the federal division of lawmaking power between the central and state government, and the other is the provision in the constitution that guarantees fundamental rights. And explain, the parliamentary system involves the fusion of the executives and legislative organs of the government, whereas the presidential system of the government is based on the principle of separation of powers among the three organs of the government. Thank you. Happy learning. We learning.